When the Sega Genesis launched in North America in the summer of 1989, it was accompanied by only a handful of games. By the end of the year, not many more had been released. This created an incredible hunger for games to play. While we had great releases like Ghouls and Ghosts, The Revenge of Shinobi, Mystic Defender, and Forgotten Worlds, their arcade nature had meant that they could be defeated in a relatively short amount of time. Replay value had of course been high for some of them, but the ravenous need for new 16-bit software was absolute. You simply wanted to see and play as much as possible. This allowed games that perhaps weren't the best an audience with many gamers that otherwise wouldn't have touched them. Among these for me was the awful Alex Kidd in the Enchanted Castle. This Master System reject looked and played barely any better than the stuff we saw the generation before, and the poorest example of 16-bit power on the platform at the time. This 2 megabit embarrassment soaked up many poor kids' rental funds, and my heart goes out to those of you that got it for Christmases and birthdays that year. But perhaps the most famous game in this category was Last Battle. Not because it was the worst launch game on the Genesis, but because it was so close to being one of the best. In this episode, we're going to take a look at it, see what it's all about, and even take a look at the game it's built on top of. I hope you guys enjoy my review of Last Battle for the Sega Genesis. Before we get into the meat of Last Battle, let's jump back a bit and look at the Japanese version that was released in July of 1989. Called Hokuto no Ken, or Fist of the North Star, it was based on a popular comic series in Japan about a post-apocalyptic world. The game itself was essentially a Kung Fu Master clone that was extremely violent. The side-scrolling stages were filled with exploding heads and the demise of blood-soaked boss characters. It was a good-looking game with huge sprites, multi-layered backgrounds, and just a general sense of a next-generation product. It had been developed internally by Sega R&D too, but the complicated Fist of the North Star license belonged to 3 or 4 other business entities, not including the companies that owned the rights to distribute it outside of Japan. This meant that when Sega brought it west, they stripped away the Fist of the North Star content, renamed the characters, changed up some of the story, and bingo, Last Battle was born. Despite these changes, the core remains very similar. It's still based on a world that has seen the ravages of war tear it apart, and it's your job to bring back hope and help heal the rift. Like the Japanese version, it's still very much a side-scrolling beat-em-up. You punch and kick your way left and right against enemies that don't seem to know any better than to attack the guy that's whooping the asses of all their friends. What sets this apart from similar games in the genre is the non-linear stage selection and how you proceed. There are 4 chapters in this game that must be defeated in order to see the ending. Each of these chapters have over a half a dozen areas that must be navigated. Each area presents a new scene that can include a simple side-scrolling level, a single fight against a boss character, and multi-level mazes that must be explored to find the way through. But you can't just go to any area you want and expect success. You must have a certain power level to have any hope of traversing the land and opening the areas you need to move on to the next chapter. But here's the kick. Last Battle has no continues. That's right, this is not an easy game, and no matter how deep you get, if you lose your life, back to the beginning you go. Many people love to talk about the difficulty of games like Ghouls and Ghosts, but this one wasn't much better. You needed to drop some serious playtime to understand the best way forward, and even then, an untimely death could ruin an entire play session. The challenge is very real in this one. Last Battle was just a 4 megabit cartridge, but even so, the variety in the visuals is quite impressive. You do see some repeated assets in the enemies, but the stages give you a bit more to look at. These stages often have multiple layers of parallax scrolling and really look impressive for such an early release. Most Genesis games had at least a few layers in the background, but this one really let it loose with some impressive depth. Things aren't always that way though. Some of the indoor stages are just flat backdrops with repeating tiles that lack any imagination at all. There are also some repeated stages because of the way you must gain power to proceed. That means seeing some of these stages again and again. But there is no denying that Last Battle was a head-turner back in 1989. Rarely had you seen characters this large and backgrounds that deep outside of an arcade cabinet. This was particularly more impressive when you compare it directly to some of the other launch software on the Genesis. I hate to beat a dead horse, but just look at it compared to the joke that was Alex Kidd in the Enchanted Castle. It's like the two are on different hardware platforms. There is no question that what initially drew me to this game was its visuals. While the graphics in Last Battle are quite nice, the sound and music are somewhat uninspiring. What's here is simple in scope and variety and honestly, doesn't sound much better than the 8-bit tunes you had been hearing for years. It's not terrible, but you'll hear much better from the hardware elsewhere. Last Battle is one of those games where I'm caught between the nostalgia of my childhood memories and the reality in its shortcomings. While it certainly looks nice for an early 16-bit title and the martial arts aspects certainly appealed to me as a kid, there's a lot here that really needs to be said. First, and let's not mince words here, the hit detection is awful and always favors the enemies. Most of your attacks need to be well inside the enemy sprite to make contact and register damage, whereas most enemies can hit you from a quarter-inch or more outside your sprite. This takes some getting used to, and man can it be frustrating. Last Battle also has the appearance of a game that is long and well laid out, but it's all a ruse. Most of these stages can be beaten in under a minute, leading to an ending that can be had in 30 or 40 minutes once you know what you're doing. What makes it feel so much longer than it actually is are the one-and-done deaths. As previously mentioned, a death, no matter how deep you are in the game, is an immediate restart back at the very beginning. There is a cheat that allows you to start back at the beginning of the last chapter you died on, but I had no clue this existed back then. Every attempt I made at defeating this came with the hair-pulling frustration of starting over if I died. You'll also notice the bosses have weapons and superpowers like projectiles. Where are your powers? Where are your weapons? Last Battle's gameplay is as shallow as the puddle your kid plays in after a rainstorm. Last Battle also has a completely pointless and nonsensical story attached to it. While the original Japanese version was based on stuff you could at least tie it to, the Western release is just a bunch of nonsense you'll care nothing about. The in-game conversations are hilariously bad and add absolutely nothing to the quality of the experience. And that really is Last Battle in a nutshell. It's a simple walk-in punch that is made much harder than it should be. A freaking checkpoint password system was sorely needed and could have really elevated the entire thing. I would understand leaving the final chapter without a password to keep the challenge up, but starting over is just terrible. For what it's worth though, there is an intangible here that can't be denied. With the Genesis fresh on the North American market, a game that looked like this and allowed you to beat people up was cool as hell. You overlooked its weaknesses and irritations because you loved how it looked and played. You could have never have had that feeling unless you were there to see it firsthand. It's the presence or absence of that nostalgia that will either make you love or hate Last Battle. Funnily enough, Sega would do the exact same thing with the Master System version of Hokuto no Ken some years earlier. When that was brought west, the license was stripped away and it became Black Belt, a similar playing beat-em-up that was more linear. I don't blame Sega for making Last Battle difficult, but I do blame them for making games like this so incredibly shallow. The average gamer will spend little time putting up with this game's nonsense. This actually isn't very different from Altered Beast in all honesty, and I understand Sega wanting something more challenging, but they just went too far in making that happen. Nobody wants to play the opening stages 50 times before they start to get good, and that's exactly what those of us that had the Genesis in those early days had to do. The Chapter Continue cheat does alleviate some of that, but you still must play the game to be able to use it. Once you turn the power off, it's right back to the beginning. And boy did Last Battle get some bad reviews at the time of its release. Most of the European magazines absolutely destroyed it. Mega rated it as the second worst game on the platform, and even the more favorable reviews from US magazines like Electronic Gaming Monthly weren't all that great. That leaves Last Battle's legacy clear-cut and unmistakable. If you played it as a kid, you likely put some time into it to come to appreciate its simple qualities. If you are coming in late to the party, looking for a great example of the better software on the Genesis, pack up your bags and keep on looking. You're not gonna find it with this one. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.